Thank you, Susan. Hello, hello. And I am beaming in from Asheville, North Carolina, where we are waiting on a snowstorm here. So I went out and did as best I could and bought lots and lots of hot chocolate because that's all the preparedness I had. I'm really excited about this panel. With the exception of tonight's finale reading, this is the last time we'll all gather together. So while I have you, let me just say how damn grateful I am. This is the second time holding the Palm Beach Festival virtually. And of course, like many of you, I miss our delightful and raucous dinners together on the Strip in Del Rey. I miss the way the ocean waves sound down the street after spending long days in the company of poetry. But nevertheless, the presence of this community is so evident, and it's been so deeply nourishing. And of course, as you guys know, this year marks the 18th of a festival that began as a dream Miles and Mimi Kuhn had with Tom Lux and Kurt Brown. And we're lucky to be gathered together again, no matter how many miles are between us. And I know that you guys know after looking at the chat, you can see just how far apart we all are. But for that, I'd like to thank all the tech wizards and determined Luddites that made this possible, including Susan and Jen and Marcy and Ira and Rachel and the many hardworking interns. And I'd also like to lend my heartfelt appreciation for this year's incredible faculty, all of whom are here now to present what has been for years my absolute favorite event, and that is the beloved Poems panel, the time in which each of the writers we've been learning from all week will go even deeper to share one poem that's close to them. This event is a time not just to hear a few favorite poems, but a true celebration of those poems, an opportunity to witness a bit of what's flowing through these poets' veins, to get a sense of the DNA coursing through their hearts and imaginations, to understand just how the poems that carry one can, in turn, carry another. As Laure-Anne Bosselaar always reminds us, what we have here is a chorus. Because when poets share their own words, what rises up is a cumulative kind of song. In this panel gathered here today, well, it's like hearing the chorus, but doubled, giving us a chance to hear the notes underneath that song we've already grown to love this week. So today, what we'll do is we'll proceed in reverse alphabetical order with this year's faculty, and of course, not one of them needs an introduction. And I'm so thrilled to hear what poem each will share with us today. And so I hope you'll help me welcome first in line, Diane Seuss.
And Susan and everybody who made this this week sing. I chose a kind of strange poem for me, and that is a poem by E.E. Cummings, and it's a sonnet. And I don't find it in very many anthologies, and it's hard to find even on the internet. And I'll read it, and then I'll tell you briefly how I encountered it and what I learned from it. It's hard to read. It's hard to know how to read. Sonnet entitled "How to Run the World." A, always don't. There be, being no such thing. For C, can't cast no shadow. D, drink, and E, eat of her voice, and whose silence the music of spring lives. F, feel, opens, but shuts, understand. G, gladly forget little, having less, with every least, each most remembering. H, highest fly, only the flag that's furled. Sestet, entitled, grass is flesh, or swim who can and bathe who must, or any dream means more than sleep, as more than know means guess. I, item. I immaculately owe, dying one life, and will my rest to these children, building this rain man out of snow. So I encountered this poem in a class when I was young and understood even less than I do now. And I had no clue how to even hear this poem, how to read it. What are these A, B, C things in it? And how is this a sonnet? And it took my mentor, a poet named Con Hilberry, here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I live, to show me how to hear this poem and how it was a sonnet. And so, for instance, there are rhymes, they just don't all follow each other in a Shakespearean way. There's thing and spring and understand, and less rhymes with something, and with guess, and so everything rhymes with something, snow and O, but he's not so worried about getting it in a particular traditional sonnet order. And he's willing to make the syntax whimsical and to ask us to sort of parse out how to make sense of the poem. I find the poem funny, witty, because, how he uses sonnet entitled, How to Run the World, and then he labels the sestet. There's that archness in Cummings. It's like, yeah, this is a sonnet. See, I'll even label it as such. And then finally, this alphabetizing, it's sort of a parody of list making, of the fact that things can be linear. So he sort of plays with that within the swish and experimental quality of his sentences. So finally, just to end, I immaculately owe, dying one life, and will my rest to these children, building this rain man out of snow. So even the snowman is actually rain. It's gonna pool there pretty soon. So I love the romantic nature, the wit, and it led me ultimately to being able to understand, harder for me poems better, to give them a chance. And ultimately, many, many years later, to write my own version of the sonnet and to realize that, yes, I too, like Cummings, can sort of trespass on that form. So thank you very much.
Hi. So the poem I brought in is by Bridget Pegan Kelly, and a quick note is I think the actual version, the title should be "Closing Time," Iskandaria. I'm not totally positive on that. It doesn't appear in any of her books, and there are a few different versions floating around online, but I think that should be the title here. So here's the poem. It was not a scorpion I asked for. I asked for a fish, but maybe God misheard my request. Maybe God thought I said, not some sort of fish, but a scorpion fish. A request he surely would have granted, being a goodly God. But then he forgot the fish attached to the scorpion because God too forgets. Everything forgets. So instead of an edible fish, any small fish, sweet or sour, or even the grotesque buffoonery of the striped scorpion fish, crowned with spines and followed by many tails, a veritable sideshow of a fish, instead of these, I was given an insect, a peculiar prehistoric creature, part lobster, part spider, part bell ringer, part son of a fallen star, something like a disfigured armored dog, not a thing you can eat or even take on a meaningful walk. So ugly is it, so stiffly does it step, as if on ice, freezing again and again in mid-air like a listening ear, and then scuttling backwards or leaping madly forward, its deadly tail doing a St. Vitus jig. God gave me a scorpion, a venomous creature to be sure, a bug with a bite of Cleopatra's asp, but not, as I soon found out, despite the dark gossip, a lover of violence or a hater of men. In truth, it is shy, the scorpion, a creature with 8 eyes and almost no sight, who shuns the daylight and is driven mad by fire, who favors the lonely spot and feeds on nothing much, and only throws out its poison barb when backed against a wall. A thing like me, but not the thing I asked for. A thing by accident or design I am now attached to. And so I draw the curtains, and so I lay out strange dishes, and so I step softly, and so I do not speak. And only twice in many years have I been stung, both times because unthinking I let in the terrible light. And sometimes now when I watch the scorpion sleep, I see how fine he is, how rare this creature called lung book or mortal book, because of his strange organs of breath. His lungs are holes in his body which open and close, and inside the holes are stiffened membranes, arranged like the pages of a book. Imagine that. And when the holes open, the pages rise up and unfold, and the blood that circles through them touches the air, and by this bath of air, the blood is made pure. He is a house of books, my shy scorpion, carrying in his belly all the perishable manuscripts, a little mirror of the library at Alexandria, which burned. So I love this poem, and why and there's so many things about it that I like, that it's hard to I almost sometimes feel nervous bringing it into a room because of my effusiveness toward the poem. Like I almost feel like when it's a type of poem that if I share it with people, and if the people don't like that poem, I worry that my opinion of them will maybe like drop down a notch or two. And some of the things I appreciate about this poem, I love the way it's a poem about about changing one's perception, or about our perceptions being changed, and about noticing the world and finding like astonishment in like sort of all corners of it. My workshop talked a little bit about the idea of defamiliarization, and how the intent behind that idea was that often we move through the world not necessarily noticing things because we're familiar with them, and familiarity makes us overlook things. And because of that, things that are truly beautiful, or things that are truly spectacular, or things that are truly awful can be accepted as normal. And the job of art is to perhaps make it so that we don't do that, so that we do notice things. I think, as Shklovsky said, art makes art makes the stone stony again. And so this makes the scorpion, you know, visible and shows it to us as like this astonishing thing, but also kind of shows us the world in that way. And the way that, so the way the scorpion transforms from again and again and again, from peculiar prehistoric creature, part lobster, part spider, part bell ringer, part son of a fallen star, something like a disfigured armored dog, not a thing you can eat or even take on a meaningful walk. So ugly so ugly is it, to later, and now I see how fine he is. It's a thing like me, a thing I'm attached to. It's this rare thing. So it's about how it's like seeing how the scorpion transforms, but also seeing how the speaker transforms, and how there's this tonal shift and this shift in thinking that happens, you know, more than once in the poem. Also, like a side note to this poem, so Bridget Pegan Kelly, once upon a time, this is kind of random, but donated a little bird's nest from her farm that I'm told that she had on the wall, on the wall in her house, where in the room where she wrote, and at the MFA program for Warren Wilson, she donated it to the program for an auction to raise money for scholarships for writers. And here it is, and I have it on my desk. And I'm always sort of hoping that like some sort of like magical vibes from this thing will radiate out onto whatever I'm working on. And I don't think that actually happens, but it's still right. It's one of my favorite things. And so this poem, I guess what I was getting at, and seeing those sort of transformations that happen, like how the scorpion transforms, but it's also sort of how the speaker transforms, and a little bit, maybe more so, how I feel sort of transformed. Pete Turchi once said, like, great literature doesn't necessarily provide us with answers, it leads us to a place of wonder. And that's how I feel in this poem. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That's one of my favorite poems as well. So I hope that that raises me in your estimation a bit. I want to not take away any time from Robert Hayden, but I'll gladly yield some of my own commentary time to express some gratitude. This week has been amazing. I've been hearing about the Palm Beach Poetry Festival for years, and it's everything that I hoped it would be. Every event, the faculty is amazing. I thank you guys all for being here, and I'm thankful to be a part of it. And again, my students, thank you for this week. The poem, let me see if I can share my screen with you guys. Do I have that function? I do. So I'll put up the poem myself for you. It's called The Diver by Robert Hayden. The diver sank through easeful azure, flower creatures flashed and shimmered there, lost images fadingly remembered, swiftly descended into canyon of cold, night green and emptiness, free falling, weightless, as in dreams of wingless flight, plunged through infraspace and came to the dead ship, carcass that swarmed with voracious life. Angelfish, their lively blue and yellow prized from darkness by the flashlight's beam, thronged her portals. Moss of bryozoans blurred, obscured her metal. Snappers, gold grappers explored her, fearless of bubbling manfish. I entered the wreck, awed by her silence, feeling more keenly the iron cold. With flashlight probing fogs of water, saw the sad, slow dance of gilded chairs, the ectoplasmic swirl of garments, drowned instruments of buoyancy, drunken shoes. Then, livid gesturings, eldritch hide and seek of laughing faces. I yearned to find those hidden ones, to fling aside the mask and call to them, yield to rapturous whisperings, have done with self and every dinning vain complexity. Yet, in languid frenzy strove, as one freezing, fight soft sleep, desiring sleep, strove against the canceling arms that suddenly surrounded me, fled the numbing kisses that I craved. Reflex of life wish, respirators brittle belling, swam from the ship somehow began the measured rise. So, in case Nickole or Rachel, if you want to put the poem up on screen while people look at my face so they can see me too. There we go. This poem here, I came to it late in my study of Robert Hayden. You know, at first I was looking at the poems that show up in anthologies a lot. Those Winter Sundays, Middle Passage, Frederick Douglass, Renegade. And when I picked up the collected poems of Robert Hayden, this is the first poem in the collection. And it's one that's really stuck with me the most. There are craft elements to be learned for sure, right? We look here at the relationship, the tension created between sentence and line, using these, or rather, as a result of the enjambment that comes from working in such a short line. Also, some of the stranger diction that can cause you to cock your head a little bit, but doesn't throw you out of the poem. But it is made just strange enough, which I think also gives itself over to the strangeness of the text itself. So the poem teaches something about the relationship between, if not form and content, even diction and content. Robert Hayden is known by many as the poet of perfect pitch. And I think that has to do largely with the way he modulates his language, where he pitches everything, the diction rather. But the main takeaways for me are two. One, in reading this poem over and over again, I learned something about subtlety, about illusion, and trust in the reader. I say that because on its surface, it's a poem about a deep sea diver, right? And it works as a poem about a deep sea diver. But I later came to regard this as an ars poetica. When Hayden writes about the diver going down, finding an abandoned or a wrecked ship, and there, like getting caught up in the magic there, getting caught up with the, where are we? Let's see, the ectoplasmic swirl of garments, the drowned buoyancy of the drowned instruments of buoyancy, the drunken shoes, and how he wanted to stay there and call out to the names and welcome the kisses. It reminds me of how often, if we're writing about or into the past, we're drawn, and we could be drawn to a sort of nostalgia, and how doing so can be dangerous. And even though you want to stay there, the writing brings us back forward. In these last couple lines, I swam somehow from the ship, somehow began the measured rise, somehow began the measured rise. To me, that's speaking to meter, prosody, craft, right? And how the craft can be something that anchors us in real time, even as we're exploring past time or downtime. I knew I wasn't crazy about this or by thinking this when I watched the movie Piñero about the poet and playwright Miguel Piñero. Played by Benjamin Bratt, there's a scene where he's talking about his life and his writing. Miguel Piñero, for those you may not know, wrote about street stuff, right? He wrote about pimps, prostitutes, junkies, all this stuff. And he wrote towards worlds that people would have left out of literature for a long time. And in the movie, there's a scene where he's saying, I got to do bad to keep the writing good. And he likens it to deep sea diving. He says, it's like when you dive down and you go down and you go down deep into the muck and you get the treasure and you bring it up for everyone else. He says, you go down there enough your ears get shot, you know, you get used to it down there. He says, you know what? Sometimes I like it better down there. And his life showed such. He suffered with drug abuse, alcoholism throughout his life. So that scene in the movie brought me back to this poem, and I reread it as Ars Poetica, and it made perfect sense to me. So, you know, again, it teaches me to trust the reader. The second and third meanings may be there, they may be hidden. An alert reader brings their writing and their habits of reading to the table, and may gain those second and third meanings, but they might miss out as well. That's fine. That's the second lesson, is to trust the writing, that even if the reader does miss it, there's still something else there that you've left behind that's useful. And then lastly, this poem taught me something about lineage and learning. I think about this poem in the context of Yusef Komunyaka's Tunnels, which is, I think, one of the first poems in Diane Dao. Tunnels was a poem that also gave me the sense that there was something going on beside the narrative. And when I looked at these poems beside each other, I saw so many similarities in language, in method, in pacing. And then I read in a book about influence where Yusef Komunyakaa actually name dropped Hayden as an influence. So I traced that. And then I traced Hayden to Auden and therefore to Yeats. And I saw from September 3rd, September 1st, 1939, some of what Hayden was up to in this poem. And I saw how Yusef remixed that. And in giving me a sign of what's been done, it gave me also a signal of something that I could do and still had to do. All right, I ran through that as quickly as possible because I didn't want to go over time, but I hope that was coherent enough to be useful to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Hello. I am really grateful for this week. It's been an amazing week. I don't even have all the words to describe how important this week has been. I do want to say, because I don't know what other space I'll have to say it. I know we're talking about beloved poems, but Yusef Komunyakaa is my beloved poet, and I wouldn't have my books, and I probably wouldn't have been on the path to knowing all of the amazing poets in this panel without his work. There's a long story behind that, but maybe in the bookstore we can talk about it. Okay. Cole. I is the total Black being spoken from the earth's inside. There are many kinds of open, how a diamond comes into a knot of flame, how sound comes into a word, colored by who pays what for speaking. Some words are open like a diamond on glass windows, singing out within the passing crash of sun. Then there are words like stapled wagers in a perforated book, buy and sign and tear apart. And come whatever wills all chances, the stub remains, an ill-pulled tooth with a ragged edge. Some words live in my throat, breeding like adders. Others know sun, seeking like gypsies over my tongue to explode through my lips like young sparrows bursting from shell. Some words bedevil me. Love is a word, another kind of open. As the diamond comes into a knot of flame, I am Black because I come from the earth's inside. Now take my word for jewel in the open light. What fascinates me, what I love about this poem, well, wait, let me back up. I don't remember exactly when I first read this poem. I know I was probably around 20 years old. And probably there was like, probably from a library book or something or other. But there's 4 things that stand out to me about it. One is that a woman, a poet, can change her mind. So in 1968, the poem was published in the book First Cities. And the that first I was at the left margin of the poem. And then in 1976, the poem was published again in the book Cole, and the I is indented. So I know this copy of the poem comes from the Poetry Foundation, but that I actually in the 1976 version is pushed over just a tiny bit, about 5 spaces. And then there's another version published in 1994 in Every Shut-Eye Ain't Asleep. And I is the total Black being spoken. It's all on the same line. And there's I, and there's about 5 spaces, and then is the total Black goes on. The line goes on like that. So I don't know all the stories behind the decisions, but there's just something that excites me about, or thinking about Lorde changing her mind about just that one placement of the I. And then there's some other versions too, where the dashes are different and the lines are broken a little bit differently toward the end of the poem. I don't have copies of all that. You don't have copies of all that, so I won't go there. Another thing that really moved me about the poem were the word choices, and particularly her choice of the word adders, especially instead of snakes. You know, just thinking about adder as a very specific, venomous, tiny snake that I also learned later, I think that whose babies are born live. I don't know, there's just a lot of viciousness encapsulated in that one word. And then the other word that fascinated me was bedevil. Bedevil, just of course, the way that it sounds and what it means, causing continuous trouble, big trouble and continuous trouble. And so I think about that in the way that the poem unfolds. So you get at the beginning a kind of, I guess, in predicament, and it turns into later a meditation on the self, on identity, on Blackness. And then also, probably above all, the biggest thing would be, this meditation on the power of words and how words can cut and hurt. There's that whole long list in the second stanza, a whole catalog of metaphors about what words do and how they work and how they live in the throat and so on and so forth. I also think it's kind of slick how in the beginning there's that how a sound comes into a word, comma, colored, and then later that's commentary around, well, not commentary, but I am Black because I come from the earth's inside. So this kind of movement from being colored and then ending on a kind of claiming or idea around Blackness, and just thinking about those 2 words alongside one another. And then the last thing I think I'll say about this poem is I love that it ends in love. And so you read the refrain about how a diamond comes into a knot of flame differently at each iteration. There's one kind of concept in the first stanza and then another at the end. And in closing, I guess I'll say, I think this echoes Matthew's comments a little earlier. I've never taught this poem. I've never spoken about it publicly. I think because I'm protective of it and its mysteries and the way that it makes me feel. Every time I read it, I hear something a little bit differently, and it just has certain kind of mysteries in it to me, like seeking the gypsies over my tongue to explode through my lips like young sparrows bursting from shell. I don't know. And I don't want those qualities to, I don't want those mysteries to fade or disappear. I've said too much in this presentation. That's all I want to say about this poem. Thank you.
I want to sign on to Matthew and Yona's statement about our reluctance to talk about or to teach poems that we love, because what if people don't get it? Or what if you somehow aren't able to articulate what matters to you about the poem? So I'm anxious about this too. This poem is by Constantine Cavafy, great Greco-Egyptian poet, lived in Alexandria, north of Egypt, early in this century, in the last century. He was described by the novelist E.M. Forster as a short Greek man in a straw hat standing at a slight angle to the rest of the universe. And that slight angle was a really complex one. Cavafy was a citizen of his city, a city bounded by space, but for him, not bounded by time. Cavafy felt that he could gossip about those who lived in Alexandria at the beginning of the millennium. He felt able to write poems which gave voice to all kinds of citizens of that city across time. And a good half of his poems, I would say, are poems that inhabit the ancient world with ease and familiarity. The other half are poems that express the speaker's homoerotic desires. He lived in a world where those desires could be fulfilled casually through brief meetings, through affairs, but not really sustained. And therefore, his poems of memory are fleeting. A moment of desire, a moment of beauty, a moment of transcendence is gone in the same way that the ancient past is gone and present for him at the same time. The poems are artifacts that hold those moments he wishes to keep. In this one, this is a poem that comes from the ancient world poems, but you might not even know it when you hear it. This is called The God Abandons Antony. It's here translated beautifully by Edmund Keeley and Philip Chard. And in this poem, here's the situation. Mark Antony is, who has been involved with Cleopatra, is being pushed out of power by Octavian, who is invading. They are about to be cast aside. And Antony has had a kind of charmed life so far, and now the god Dionysus is abandoning him. But the poem doesn't need any more than that. You really hardly even need to know that, because this is a poem about anyone losing a city. And by city, Cavafy means all that he had transformed into feeling. All of a whole life, the associations, the memories, the rooms where you loved, the rooms of passion, the rooms of disappearance. The god abandons Antony. When suddenly, at midnight, you hear an invisible procession going by with exquisite music, voices. Don't mourn your luck that's failing now. Work gone wrong, your plans all proving deceptive. Don't mourn them uselessly. As one long prepared and graced with courage, say goodbye to her, the Alexandria that is leaving. Above all, don't fool yourself. Don't say it was a dream, your ears deceived you. Don't degrade yourself with empty hopes like these. As one long prepared and graced with courage, as is right for you who were given this kind of city, go firmly to the window and listen with deep emotion, but not with the whining, the pleas of a coward. Listen, your final delectation, to the voices, to the exquisite music of that strange procession, and say goodbye to her, to the Alexandria you are losing. Well, what I love about this poem is the gesture it makes towards anyone who is grieving, anyone in a state of loss or incipient loss, anticipatory loss. It asks us to recall, even as something beloved is disappearing, even as the exquisite music and voices go by us, that we were privy to them, that we were privileged to have that kind of city, to live a life which we could treasure in that way, which brought such pleasure, such depth, such complex performances, such beauty. You who were given this kind of city, go firmly to the window and listen with deep emotion. If you were given that kind of city, if you can hold and embrace what your life has given you, then your final delectation, and that's an amazing word there, delectation, what you may find delectable is the past. It's what is going away. The voices, the exquisite music, that procession of what you lose. I think this is a beautiful accommodation, an embrace of what cannot be embraced. And therefore, it's a poem that has stood me in good stead and that I turn back to when I feel more like being a coward, when my courage fails, or when I don't feel graced. I think the poem restores that to us. I think that's all I want to say.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone at the festival. This has been such a rich experience being with all of you. An electric experience in more ways than one. I'm going to read a poem by Ruth Stone today, dozens and dozens of beloved poems, but I've chosen this one because I was fortunate enough to visit Ruth Stone for the last 2 years of her life up in Ripon, Vermont, and hear her recite during each visit when she was bedridden, poems out of from her entire career. This is an anthology that was done near the end of her life, New and Selected Poems, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize that actually W.S. Merwin won, but he wrote to Ruth Stone saying, Ruth, you should have won this prize. She was in her mid-90s at the time. So I was just spellbound listening to Ruth actually recite almost every single poem in this book from memory. She had an eidetic memory, but she would say, I said, Ruth, could you recite Orchard for me? Going way back to one of her first books, her first book in an iridescent time, she would say, how's it go? And I would read the first line, and then she would just recite perfectly the poem, and whatever poem it was from any of her books. It was such an incredible inspiration to me. And I fell in love. I'd always loved her poetry, but I fell in love with it even more just listening to her. I felt so privileged to sit by her bedside and just listen to her recite to me, not read, but recite to me. And then laugh, that wonderful laugh she had usually at the end of every poem, even if it was a sad poem. But I'm going to read a poem that she wrote in 1958 called Speculation. It's such a powerful kind of proleptic poem. She's imagining her death, not just her death, but her burial. And so the poem is transcendent and paradoxical at the same time. She's not alive. She knows that she's not alive in the poem, and yet she's talking about life and the world and everything in it that's been so transformative to her. It's really an amazing poem. It also sounds sort of like a formal poem. It's not strictly formal, but it's fascinating to compare that early sort of almost Shakespearean language that she used to her later poems that were so powerful as free verse poems. A poem like, say, Tell Me, where she says, tell me, Ruth, how is your vision? Of course, she was blind the last about 10 years of her life, almost completely blind. Lord, I say, I know you not how it is. Lord, I say, know you not how it is with me, you who are blind to the sorrow of all things temporal. You see, it's just this wonderful free verse that's so direct and spellbinding. I was just amazed to discover this poem, Speculation, because it was so prophetic. I was at her burial, which took place at her house in Goshen, behind her house, and the plot in this poem, her burial plot, is so similar to the one she wrote about in 1958. It's actually kind of spooky how prophetic this poem is and how precise it is as far as what she imagined her grave to be like. So I'll read it and then just say a few words about it. And it's called Speculation. In the coolness here, I care not for the down-pressed noises overhead. I hear in my pearly bone the wear of marble under the rain. Nothing is truly dead. There is only the wearing away, the changing of means, nor eyes I have to tell how in the summer the morning dove rocks on the hemlock's arm, nor ears to rend the sad, regretful mind with the call of the horned lark. I lie so still that the earth around me shakes with the weight of day. I do not mind if the vase holds decomposed cut flowers, or if they send one of their kind to tidy up. Such play I have no memories of, nor of the fire bush flowers, or the bark of the rough pine, or the crows where the great haw and flap circle in kinned excitement when a wind blows. I am kin with none of these, nor even wed to the yellowing silk that splits my sensitive bones, which dreaded, as all the living do, the dead, wait for some unappointed pattern. The wits of countless centuries dry in my skull, and overhead, I do not heed the first rain out of winter, nor do I care what they have planted. At my center, the bone glistens, of wondrous bones I am made, and alone shine in a phosphorus glow. So in this little plot where I am laid. It's just an amazing poem. I get so moved every time I hear it or read it back to myself. Ruth didn't have any formal college education. She was just a sponge for eloquent language. Her husband, Walter, who killed himself shortly after this poem was written, actually, when they were in England together, and that she wrote about for the rest of her life, used to read to her, and she used to read to him, and from great poetry. But what's so amazing to me about this poem is, and I don't think I've ever read a poem quite like it, is this paradoxical sort of voice that she takes in the poem of writing about the world in such a vivid way, and the natural world in particular, after she's died, but also acknowledging that she's dead as well when she's writing this. Nor eyes have I to tell in the summer the morning dove rocks on the hemlock's arms, nor ears to rend the sad, regretful mind. So it's a sort of acknowledgement of the fact that she is no longer around to observe these things, but observing them in such a vivid, live way through the lens of death, if you will, that or her imagined death, that seems even more intense and vivid and clear than through her live eyes. So I find it so wonderfully paradoxical, vivid, and moving. I just feel so thankful to Ruth for her legacy, her poems that she wrote under a lot of duress throughout her life. She was, as Whitman might say, one of the roughs. As a woman, she was one of the roughs who wrote in out of the limelight, and perhaps that was she always kind of regretted that she wasn't getting more attention. What she did at the end of her life, and but writing in the in the woods, as she was most of her life, up in Goshen, Ripon, Vermont. She had this, I don't think she maybe fully appreciated it throughout her whole life, perspective that a lot of poets who were writing in the limelight. And so it was a great thrill just to be with her and to find a poem like this. Thank you.
Okay, well, Very interesting, Chard, because out of all the gin joints and all the towns and all the world, Ruth Stones has walked into this one twice, because my poem is also by Ruth Stone. So that was a nice bit of magic that we got to have virtually here. So I want to read you the poem, and please don't share the screen yet, because I just like people to listen the first time, and then we can look at it on the page. Just want to hear it in the air first. So this is, and I'll talk a little bit about it after I read it to you. This is Train Ride by Ruth Stone. All things come to an end. Small calves in Arkansas, the bend of the muddy river. Do all things come to an end? No, they go on forever. They go on forever. The swamp, the vine-choked cypress, the oaks rattling last year's leaves, the thump of the rails, the kite, the still white stilted heron. All things come to an end. The red clay bank, the spread hawk, the bodies riding this train, the stalled talk goes on forever, the wide drive watch. Release, release. You will, I will listen. All things come to an end. No, they go on forever. When I was starting to perform with my harmonica, I had a train song that I had learned, and I hadn't actually yet written any train poems, and I needed at least a ghost of a reason to bring out my harmonica during a poetry reading. So I was looking for train poems, and happily I found Ruth Stone's Train Ride. And I fell under the poem spell so much that I just didn't want to analyze it. I just wanted to say it over and over. Because I think sometimes saying a poem, brings you into a certain space and a certain quality of feeling that while you're held inside that poem, you are, if you say the words of the poem, it literally changes your, I don't know, everything from your brain waves to everything else that happens in your body in the space that you're there. So I just wanted to say this poem over and over at first. I read my mother's memorial reading a few years ago, but somehow Arkansas imagery seemed far removed from the tennis club in Maryland when we were gathered. But I felt and still feel that it holds that magical what is of consciousness every time I read it. So maybe if you want to share this screen, just to show it to people now, that might be helpful for us. I just want to say a few things about it. So she shows us the scenery, the train ride, the calves, the river, the cypress, the oaks, the kite, the heron, the hawk, the things of the natural world that suggest both cycles and ongoingness. Of course, a train ride is a journey. The river has its journey to the sea. The calves will, in time, grow into mature animals. The oaks are rattling last year's leaves. The geese are migrating somewhere. So all of that sense of ongoingness and a journey and really circularity as well. And then there is, of course, the music of it, the sound of rattling leaves, the thump of the rails, the talk. She gives us the silence as well, which is part of all music, that still white stilted heron. The rhymes and the sounds, how they call to each other, end and bend and muddy, river and forever, still white, stilted, bank and hawk and truck and talk and talk, geese, release, release, fever, forever. So there is all that music and patterning holding it together. And then, of course, that repeated refrain that holds such a paradox in it, both the spirituality and the absolute love of the physical world, and the all things come to an end. That she asked it first as a question. Do all things come to an end? No, they go on forever. They go on forever. And then all things come to an end. And then the talk goes on forever. And then that line right before she repeats the refrain, send what you will, I will listen. Between cold death and a fever, send what you will, I will listen. I love that moment in the poem, the address to the you, which is God, spirit, life, all of it, send what you will. And then back to that beautiful paradox, all things come to an end. No, they go on forever. And those lines just hit me freshly every time, even though I've heard them before in the poem. The seasons recur, but the natural world is still there. And the proofs are the same. The natural world ends, the bodies end, and yet they also go on. And I just think it's amazing the way she articulates that paradox. And finally, I love the trope of the train when I see those parallel tracks that are just going on to infinity. And it makes me think of what Matthew said, literature leads us to a place of wonder. And that's what this poem does to me and for me, but to me mostly. So that's why I wanted to share it with you.
Thank you so much for all of you. Thank you for 2 poems by Ruth Stone, and thank you for the other poems you brought. One guy called Thomas Lux would have loved to be here and listen to the panel. It's become a little tradition that I end by reading a poem by Thomas Lux and just letting it float in the air, but bring him in with us so that we can all breathe a little bit of his extraordinary talent. And so my poem that I'm going to read today has to do with writing, has to do with our, Yona said it so well, I don't have the words, although all we do is try to find the words, right? So Thomas Lux's poem, he would have bellowed the title. So I'm going to try to do a Lux for you, but it's never bellowed enough, and then I'll just read it without bellowing. Onomatomania, he would have said. Onomatomania, the word for the inability to find the right word, leads me to self-diagnose. Onomatomaniac. It's not the 20-volume OED I need, nor Dr. Roget's book, which offers equals only, never discovery. I accept the fallibility of language, its spastic elasticity, its Jake leg, as well as prima ballerina dances. I accept that language can be manipulated towards deceit. Example, the Mahatma propaganda, i.e. Goebbels. I accept and mourn, though not a lot, the loss of the dash semicolon pair. It's the sound of a pause unlike no other pause. And when the words are tedious, and tedious also their order, sew me up in a rug and toss me in the sea. Language is dying, the novel is dying, poetry is a corpse colder than the Iceman. They've all been dying for thousands of years. Yet, people still write, people still read, and everyone knows that nothing is really real until it is written. Until it is written. Even those who cannot read know that. Thank you, Thomas Lux.